What's happening YouTube? I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine who goes by the title Dr. Michael Shults. I've been a fan of Michael's for years now. We went to the same school. We both went to the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and Michael got his graduate degree there. I got my undergrad degree there. I first became familiar with his jazz playing just through a post that he made in Jam of the Week on Facebook. He goes on to play just a perfect bebop chorus over the changes to All the Things You Are. I was super inspired by this. I learned a lot of these lines in the solo and still play them today. Hearing this great chorus over All the Things You Are put this cat on my radar, and I wanted to learn more about him immediately. Come to find out, he's actually also a phenomenal classical player. I found over the years that there is a lot of collegiate saxophone teachers that can both play jazz and classical, but I think of all the ones that I've seen, Michael is probably one of the very best in both disciplines and plays both at the very high and professional level that you would expect of a doctor of music in either jazz studies or in classical studies. He is the professor of saxophone at the University of Memphis, the Rudy E. Scheidt School of Music. He also holds the lead tenor in the Memphis Jazz Orchestra, as well as holding the alto chair in the Coalescent Quartet. Hope you really dig this interview with Dr. Shults. You can find plenty of information about him in the links in the description below. For now, let's get to the interview. So what was your first major light bulb moment for you as a player, like developing and learning jazz improvisation? Like a lot of us, we start out improvising, or we start out reading music and reading sheet music and stuff like that. When did you first like make that connection between like improvisation is super fun and it just was something that you decided you wanted to pursue? Do you remember like that specific moment, or like how did you get turned on to it?
Yeah, I don't know if there was a light bulb moment. I think for me, when I talk to other people that got into jazz, a lot of times they tell these stories about maybe coming around from another angle. So they'll say like, "Oh, well, my parents listened to Earth, Wind, and Fire or Stevie Wonder or some like jazz adjacent music, and
Hmm.
then through the back door they ended up getting into jazz." I think for me, I was thinking about this recently. Like, I think where I developed an interest was actually like there was a little bit more jazz and popular culture in the 90s when I was growing up. Like
Hmm.
the interludes of Frasier, for instance. If you watch that old show on NBC, Frasier, like they have
Yeah.
have a rhythm section playing these little jingles. And I really like that sound. Or on NPR, there was a syndicated show called What Do You Know? And they
Okay.
had, like the house band was a piano trio and they would do they do kind of the segment and then they would read the ads and there would be a trio playing behind it and they would let the trio like they play a tune and
Yeah.
take clothes and stuff and so it would just be the trio for like a few minutes and then they would read ads and I just like sort of intrinsically liked that sound. I think kind of my interest was piqued at a pretty young age with that. I think with improvising, maybe a moment I had in high school, I took a lesson from a guy named Tim Abyashan who teaches at Truman State University,
Okay.
which is Kirksville, Missouri. It's about an hour and a half from Hannibal, where I went to high school. And I think I had listened a lot, and so I had a really good concept with like eighth note feel and sound, but I didn't understand when I would hear great players, it was like, how are they pulling these beautiful lines out of the ether? How are they doing that spontaneously?
Yeah.
And we worked on he just gave me a little piece of dominant chord, that kind of flat nine sharp nine language to apply to the eighth bar of a blues. And he
Hmm.
started talking about how that not all dominants are created equally, that this is a secondary dominant and it tonicizes the two chord, and this is
Yeah.
the sound that you could use. And so he gave me a little one or two pieces of stock vocabulary and just put a track on and
Yeah.
say, okay, you're not going to improvise, you're just going to hear the changes go by. You're going to feel that harmonic rhythm. When you get to the eighth measure, you're going to plug this in.
Play that thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes I think in jazz education, maybe we spend so much time talking about in generalities like tell a story or communicate with your rhythm section. And of course, all that stuff is vital.
Yeah.
But sometimes don't feel as comfortable talking about sort of the concrete sequential elements of developing a vocabulary so that you can get to those concepts, right? And
Sure.
I think that probably that lesson with Tim, um, it made me realize that really what I had to start getting together was vocabulary in sort of a concrete sequential way.
Yeah, that's so great that you identify that one specific measure of the blues though too, because I remember a similar thing for me, and that was huge in my development. I kind of forgot about it until you just mentioned it. But Gene Walker had showed me a lick. Gene Walker at Ohio State
Uh-huh.
was one of my first jazz teachers when I was a freshman, and he did the same thing. Like he showed me, he's just like play this over the eighth bar, and it's going to sound good every time. And it was just like this simple thing that just like outlined the
Right.
the five going down to the third, and then it jumped up to like the sharp nine or something. It was like
Right.
really hip line. And then I started to hear him play it all the time.
Uh,
And then it was something that every time I got to that measure, I would just play it every time because it just sounded so good. But that was what made it makes that connection between like, oh, this is why you learn language because it's going to make everything sound right when you need something to sound right in a certain moment.
I think with sometimes I'll have students that maybe that feels a little bit dishonest to them, like they feel like they're cheating a little bit, but I'll say, okay, let's listen to this alternate take of a great, bop or post bop era player, we're
Hmm.
going to listen to this alternate take of Charlie Parker or Clifford Brown or even Coltrane, and notice that a lot of that vocabulary repeats, so the greatest improvisers, the people we're all studying, they were doing that stuff too. I mean, obviously, I think a great goal is to be purely extemporaneous when we play, but you're not going to get to that place until you go through a period, I think, of being able to play it, which also means being able to hear it. Um, you
Yep.
have to go through that moment. So when I was sort of introduced to that, um, it made improvising seem a little less mystical, something I could sort of concretely, objectively work on, and I liked that. That really unlocked some doors for me, I think.
Yeah, it makes it a lot less hopeless of a feeling. Like you're not like, oh, I'll never be able to improvise because I'm just not cut. I'm not made for it or whatever. It gives you like just a list of things that you can do. That's awesome, man. I love that. Great answer. So question number two is, what is one thing you've been focusing on recently in your practice sessions? And I know that you're both classical and jazz, and you do both like amazingly well. How do you balance that? And specifically with jazz, like how do you keep your improvisation skills like happening?
Yeah, I think I had a really formative moment in my mid 20s with a guy named Matt Otto. Um, I don't know if you're hip to Matt's playing, but he's one of my favorite players anywhere. He
Nice.
went to, he lived in, he went to Berkeley in Indiana and lived in LA for a long time, Tokyo for a while.
Hmm.
Uh, and then his wife got a job as, I think, an English professor at William Jewell College, which is outside of Kansas City. And so Matt, I think, kind of begrudgingly, moved to KC. Like he had been in LA and was playing with a lot of heavies out there, Anthony Wilson and um, some other people, and I think he kind of moved to KC side and seen and didn't know what to expect. And then it turns out he loved it and got super plugged in. And now he's on faculty at University of Kansas in Lawrence. I didn't formally study with him, but I just kind of considered him a little bit of a mentor. We played some gigs together. You can even find on YouTube, like there's one gig where he was playing like Iwi and I played alto. It was kind of a weird combination. Matt had RSI injuries, repetitive stress injuries, in his 20s, just from overexerting himself. And the doctors basically said, like, you have like the tendons of like a 60-year-old man.
Oof.
It'll never get better, but here's what you can do to kind of not make it worse. So Matt developed all these ways of practicing that didn't involve being on the horn. So some of it was like, and you can go to his website, he has a lot of stuff about this, but a lot of it involved like singing with drones. Like when he was living in LA, he would put a cassette in that had a drone, and then he would um, sing an idea over the drone, but then finger in different keys on the
Wow.
string. And so when I hear Matt play, it's like the percentage of the ideas that he executes that he's actually like really deeply hearing,
Hmm.
I just felt like was so much higher than mine. I felt like I was using a lot of muscle memory. I think it still sounded good. I listened to recordings from back then. It's not that I think it sounded bad, but it didn't feel quite as honest. Circling back to your question, the last 10 years, I mean, the majority of my practice has been in sort of the concert saxophone space. And so I found that I think there are certain elements of my playing that maybe are not at quite as strong as they were 10 years ago, like fast tempos, for instance. If I'm on a gig and somebody calls something a little bit off the beaten path that maybe I knew at one point, but I'm like, I don't know if I could do it now. But then the trade off for me is that I feel like in terms of my command of the mechanism, it's better than it's ever been on the saxophone. And so I think I shifted to integrate aural training to what I'm practicing a lot more. Maybe I'll be working on a passage, a classical saxophone passage, or even like working on a fairling, something as relatively simple as a fairling. Um, I'll try to sing those ideas, make that connection between my fingers and my ears, and how it might lay over harmony. Um, so these days, I think that's really it's kind of out of necessity almost that I'm spending less time maybe absorbing jazz vernacular than I used to. I maybe have fewer devices under my fingers, but I find myself relying a little bit more on my ears. It's still obviously a work in progress, but I feel that playing that way definitely invites other people in more. When I play with other people, there's a little bit more dialogue, there's a little bit more architecture. So I think that's, your question was, what am I practicing now, right?
Yeah, just like what have you been focusing on, and more just because like I've kind of abandoned the classical thing, so I'm sort of tailoring it more to jazz and just getting
Right,
better at improvisation.
right.
But I appreciate you. I mean, answering that because it's probably not like the focal point of your practice session, but you're still so great at it. So that's the reason why I wanted to just get your take on it because not many people can do what you do. Like it's
Oh,
pretty amazing to be able to balance both and be so great at both of them.
well,
So,
thanks. I've heard your recording of the Bonneau Caprice, so I know.
yeah,
I mean, I know you were dealing
it's just
when you were working on that, at least.
ancient history now, but I appreciate it. Thanks, man.
So I guess the concise answer would just be when I do practice ideas, I'm making sure that I sing them against the drone first. I'm doing less sort of memorizing and regurgitating and more trying to get into how a certain idea sounds. And I feel like there's a lower volume of new ideas that I'm practicing or new vocabulary that I'm practicing, but maybe I'm getting more out of the things that I am working on and learning a larger lesson about like, why does this vocabulary work?
Totally. And I'm curious now because this is something I wish I always had done when I was playing a lot of that contemporary music is like, how often do you analyze harmonically what's happening in some of those modern compositions? Because like, I think you made an Instagram post like super recently about the Dozenklo or some like
Mhm.
sort of diminished idea that was in there. Like there's so many things like that happen in all those pieces, like the Iber and all those things. Like, have you harmonically gone through since you play those pieces a lot and figured out like what those sequences are and stuff like that? Because that I know if I still did it, I probably would go back and look at it. I guess that whole thought process is kind of related to vocabulary. Like
Uh-huh.
it's very different kind of vocabulary, but that could be what makes you sound so fresh when you go to play jazz and you haven't necessarily improvised like over Donna Lee for a little while, but you have all
Right.
these like crazy shapes and ideas in your head floating around.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm not necessarily looking at a melody and in a very direct way, thinking about how it relates to the piano or the orchestra and the score. More
Hmm.
that I'm looking at a certain line that I feel like might fit neatly in a certain tonality, and then going to the piano and figuring out what kind of different chords this might work over. So, like in Days and Claw, there's a little line that was pretty much like on alto, like E pentatonic. And so I'm going to the piano and thinking, well, how does this sound over B minor 11? Or how does it sound over B flat alt? You know what I mean? Like thinking of all the different possibilities when I get that. And then I find that my knowledge of like the scales that we practice in jazz helps expedite the process of learning music a little quicker, because rather than thinking of every individual note, I can see a chunk and say, like in the Tamazi Ballade, there's a little upward run I was working on with a student, and I said, oh well, that's just E flat melodic minor. It starts on a D, so it's really like D alt, you know. But
Yeah.
they didn't have that background in improvisation, so they had to actually like look at every individual note. Definitely taking things like from liqueur, that's another one too. There's a lot of great diminished and whole tone exercises in there.
Hmm.
And yeah, just seeing how, if I'm going to do the legwork to commit this to memory already, I might as well put a little bit of extra work into it and retain it in a more global way.
Yeah. No, I love that, man. That's a great answer. So, third question: who is the last saxophone player you listened to and thought to yourself, "Damn, that's killing"?
Man, so this week I've been really into this dude who I think lives in Paris, Plume, or
Okay.
two. Like I know on social media it's like Two Plumes or something like that, and he has a record out. Let me pull it up here. Yeah, I mean, so his artist name, he just goes by Plume, Plume. I'm
Hmm.
pretty sure he lives in Paris, and he's got a record out called Holding On. Man, he just sounds so great. And then on the last track, it's like a two alto thing with my friend Matt Chalk. Do you know Chalk?
I don't.
Matt was he went to New School, and then he's from KC,
Hmm.
and so he was a few years younger than me, but was somebody that like just scared me to death.
Yeah.
Like he was playing in high school. I mean, I was starting to feel good about my playing like later in undergrad, and I heard Matt, and he was like 16, going to Shawnee Mission East High School, and like just playing me under the table. And he's got a really unique personal bent. Like I definitely hear some elements of like Labano's playing, but on alto a little
Hmm.
bit. But Matt's got his own thing. I mean, he sounds very personal. So yeah, that's I was checking out that track. I think it's the last track on this record, "Holding On" by Plume, with him and Matt Chalk playing, and it's like I heard that, and it's like that's such a unique feeling, right? Of you're feeling like admiration and inspiration, but also like maybe I should admit this, but it's hard not to hear and go like, dang, like I
Yeah.
feel secure now, you know? Um,
Yeah, it's this weird type of motivation that is not it's not entirely healthy, I guess you could say. It's like
mhm,
you're motivated for maybe not the best reasons in the world sometimes to go shed, but I think that's the initial like shock to your system to hear is like, oh, this person put in way much more
right,
work than I have on this specific thing, but then overall the result ends up being positive. But yeah, the
right.
initial thing is always just like,
Yeah, no, that's definitely how I felt listening to that. It's like,
Mhm.
that's how I would sound if I was good, you know?
Right.
Um, and then I think on top of that, I've been thinking about recently, with my students here at University of Memphis, just making sure, especially the jazz students, just making sure that they know the lineage of great saxophone players from here. Um,
Hmm.
Obviously, like Kirk Whalum still lives in town; he still performs here pretty regularly. But if you go back and there's people like obviously George Coleman, Charles Lloyd, who was just in town recently,
Yeah,
uh,
man.
Hank Crawford. I've been listening to Hank with Jimmy McGriff stepping up this week, and then Frank Strozier. Like in terms of somebody that I feel like plays kind of in a similar way that I want to play, which is like linear. Strozier is the man, and I'm really trying to figure out. I'm trying to track his whereabouts are kind of mysterious.
Hmm.
He's like not. I As far as I know, he's still living, but I don't think he's playing saxophone anymore. And I've kind of tried to figure out what the story is there, but I don't. It's kind of mysterious, you know. So yeah, Strozier this week, Hank Crawford, and Plume and Chalk.
I love it, man. Yeah, no, because it's really hard to narrow it down to just one. And again, like my mind kind of always goes to contemporary players, but I love that you're saying all different age brackets and different time periods too, because people that see this are definitely gonna want to check all those things out. I'm gonna go check all those things out.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
I've never actually listened to a Hank Crawford record. Like I only know the stuff that he did. He did play with Ray Charles, right?
Right.
Like
Uh-huh.
some of those solos, but I don't actually know his playing like separate from that, and that's my bad.
Yeah. Well, there's a famous barbecue joint in town here called Cozy Corner,
Hmm.
and it's like it's like what people envision when they think of like a mom and pop barbecue joint in, a city
Yeah.
like Memphis or Kansas City or wherever. And right inside the door, there's like a photo of Hank Crawford with the owner. Um,
Nice.
and so that kind of recently I was in there and I was like, man, I haven't checked out Hank in a minute, So I went to a record store here and got some of that stuff with Jimmy McGriff. It's so swinging and soulful, and he sounds great.
Awesome, man. Yeah, thank you. The questions kind of travel in different directions, but the fourth one is, what is your current saxophone setup? And you can say jazz and classical if you
Yeah.
feel like. And I guess since you do soprano, alto, do you play a lot of tenor?
Yeah, I play on jazz tenor. I'm playing lead tenor with Memphis Jazz Orchestra,
Nice.
and actually just kind of took over as musical director there. So
Oh,
the band's
killing.
been around playing. We have a Sunday residency at Alfred's on Beale in Memphis, and there's a great trombone player who used to play in the Navy Commodores named Howard Lamb, and
Hmm.
Howard's been running it for 30 years, and just celebrated his 80th birthday, and I think part of that was he's still going to play in the section, but kind of stepping down as musical director. So, um, yeah, I'm playing on jazz alto. I play Yamaha EX2 with a V1 gold-plated neck, and then I just play the D'Addario D6M mouthpiece. I really like it. It was one of the ones they kind of sent me when the mouthpiece first came out, and I've always been happy with it. I
Hmm.
play Strength 3 D'Addario Reserve reed, so kind of their classical reed. I play that on my jazz setup, maybe just
Nice.
because it feels more familiar. There's kind of a thickness, I think, in there that I like. And then I use a ligature called a KC Tone by this guy named Mark Farmer. I don't know if he still makes them or not. Actually, Chalk, we were talking about Chalk. Chalk gave it to me. We traded. I had a ligature that I gave him, and we kind of traded a few years ago. So I'm playing a KC Tone ligature. On my classical setup, I play a D'Addario Reserve 155 with
Hmm.
3+ reserve reeds. Ligature, I've been going back and forth between a few things. And then I play a V1 neck on my classical setup.
Same horn too, like same horn and neck.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yes, actually a different neck. I use the gold plated for jazz and then just the regular lacquer for classical. And I think most people would probably reverse those, but I actually found that the gold plated made more of a difference for me with my jazz setup. Uh,
Interesting. Yeah.
and on tenor, yeah, I'm playing a Yamaha. I'm just playing a 62 right now, which I really like. Like I know you've played it. You had like that silver 62 for a long time, right?
Yeah, I got it unlacquered. Like I had John Ledbetter do that in like 2013, and I actually went back to it. Like I play that now. That's like my main tenor, and I'm gonna get a jail horn. But like I noticed that the neck makes the biggest difference with all the Yamaha horns. Like it can make a very big color difference.
It totally does. Yeah, when I switched over from, I think when I first bought my last, I had an EX1 for a long time, and I
Hmm.
was just playing the G1 that came with it. And it wasn't that I was like, oh, something's wrong here or anything, but can't remember the context. But I was just trying out some necks, and I popped on a V1, and it was like a different instrument. That's one reason that I like Yamaha horns is that
Hmm.
all the different options with necks, and
Yeah.
it's not one size fits all. Like I recommended hard the V1 to the guy that plays second alto in MJO, and he was like, it was not hidden for him at all.
Yeah.
But it's so different player to player. But
All right.
and then on tenor, so I'm playing that 62, but I just got a second hand. I got a Metal Link 7 star. I think it's a New York Link. I don't know that much about it, um,
Hmm.
but I've been playing that lately and really happy with it. But I've also played the D'Addario D8M hard rubber mouthpiece. But I'm on this Link now, and I'm really liking it on tenor.
Nice. And you're using the 62 neck.
Hmm. Yeah,
Cool.
I haven't experimented on my tenor with necks yet, though.
Yeah, I mean that got me real good. Like I wasn't a fan of the tenor necks in general, just the Yamaha ones. So when I started messing with other stuff, it's yeah, you like it.
Right.
You
Cool.
can only go up, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I hear you.
Um, very cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So two more questions. Number five is, what was your most favorite gig you've ever played, and why does it stand out in your memory? It could be like location or the vibe of the band or the response from the audience? It could be, or just all three of those things combined. Like what was your favorite one?
You know, um, this is weird, but it was actually my DMA lecture recital. So
Nice.
I did a my doctorate is in classical performance, however you want to say that, in saxophone performance, and all of my studies were with Zach Sheeman from the Prism Quartet, and um, so all the components of that degree were related to my concert saxophone studies and performing. The one exception was I had actually already gotten the job at UW Eau Claire, so I was living up in Eau Claire, and I asked him. I said, can my DMA lecture recital, can my lecture recital be on some jazz topic? And partially it was because it was just easier to pull that off remotely, like on one rehearsal. Whereas like if I was going to play, Albright, I'd have to drive down every weekend for 2 months to put that together with a pianist. And so I did a lecture recital on the compositions of Bobby Watson because that's I knew I had access to Bobby. We're friends, and I studied with him, and I also just felt like he's one of the great living composers, and there wasn't a lot of scholarship on his music at that time. So there
Yeah.
was a club in Kansas City, over in the Kansas suburbs, called Take Five, and
Hmm.
it's my favorite club I've ever played. It was just the ownership, Doug and Lori Chandler. They're good friends. They really curated the people that played there were always really strong. Like it's a club you could go to and know that whoever they booked was going to bring something really unique and cool to the table.
Hmm.
And they were at the shows. They would come. They work all day, and then they would stick around and listen to music. They loved the music. So it was a really great club, and so I got a band together of guys, and you can find it. There's a little bit of it on YouTube, but I got a band together of guys to, I would talk down, I would analyze the composition and intersperse little quotes from Bobby from a recorded interview where he would talk about the music, and and then we would play the tune down. And I had told Bobby about it and kind of said like, hey, no pressure. I know it might be awkward since I'm talking about your music with you in the room. Like, you don't have to come, but just know this is going on. You're welcome to stop by. And he was kind of non-committal, and we were getting towards the end of the night, and uh, the door opened and everyone turned around and everyone started clapping because Bobby had showed up with his horn.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and so the energy, the vibe just went through the roof, and he came up and we played Wheel Within a Wheel, and then we closed, not one of his tunes, but then we closed with Moanin'.
Nice.
And man, he just, it just leveled everything up. And so it was the combination of the venue, which I loved, the crowd, which was a lot of people that were near and dear to me. It was a big crowd. And then just playing with Bobby, it felt like a capstone, of sorts, like the kind of perfect capstone to my academic career. And, he just, Bobby's one of those guys that you really can't understand the full scope of his genius on the horn unless you hear him in person. Which is not to say the studio records aren't great. They are. I've not really ever seen a saxophone player that knew how to get house in an intellectual way,
Hmm.
like not gimmicks, not goofy stuff, not physical things on the stage. It's like he just knows how to play great content that like the jazz heads are like geeking out on, but like the lay people are like, I don't know what that was, but that was amazing, and so
Yeah, man.
he just brought the house down. So if you look on YouTube, it's not my favorite solo of mine. I kind of am not super proud of my playing on this, but if you look up, if you type in like my name and Bobby Watson and Moanin', there's a clip of Bobby's solo on that. It's just you kind of get an idea of like what a raucous night it was.
Oh, I'm sure it's amazing, man. And like, I think if you're doing a DMA on a person, if you can get the person to show up and then they crush it, like you kind of
Right.
did your job for
Yeah.
that for that
Yeah.
tune. That's so awesome. I got to see Bobby play that tune actually in Cleveland, and this was like maybe 2003 or 2002,
Mhm.
and he was playing with Dominic Farinacci and a lot of the Tri-C
Yeah.
gang.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. Like I didn't really know his playing at all, but hearing him live is just, it's massive. Like
Yeah.
because he appeals to everybody. Like the audience was going nuts over him,
Yeah.
and me as a saxophone player, I was like, this is like,
Right.
all the language he was playing was amazing, but also he had that like gut bucket stuff happening too.
Yeah, there's something visceral about his playing. I'll
Yeah.
say it again. That it's hard to quantify, but I think it's
Hmm.
that there's there's a blues sensibility there, and but I also think that he's such a good communicator as a person, and he has a lot of friendships inside and outside of music. Like he really relates to a wide spectrum of people as a person. And I think
Hmm.
that's kind of what comes through in the way that he plays. Like he's always thinking about everybody in the room.
Yeah.
So that was one of those. I up to that point I had felt pretty good about my playing. That night I was thinking, okay, I did a good job. And then at the end of the night, it's like, okay, that's what mastery sounds like.
Right.
I'm a facsimile.
I love that it was your DMA recital, and it ended up being way more like probably like a jazz concert. Like when you go to see Benny Golson or anybody like that, they talk a lot about the tunes and the compositions, and that's I think that's the most ideal experience for the audience. So when you
Right.
said DMA lecture recital, I was just like imagining it being at like some hall in the school,
Yeah.
but if it's at a
Right.
jazz club, that's like it's about as good as it gets, man. It's great.
Oh, it's cool. I always say I think I'm maybe the only person that ever charged admission to a DMA lecture recital. Actually sold tickets.
Yeah, man.
So
That's great. So yeah, the last question on the list is what other instruments do you play and how do they help your saxophone playing? This could be doubles or, you know, rhythm section instruments and things like that.
yeah. Well, the answer is I really don't. You know,
Nice.
I was a functional doubler. I would say 10 years ago I could, if I had enough time with it and the part wasn't too difficult, I could play well enough to hide in a college big band with flute and clarinet. I feel that playing concert saxophone authentically and playing jazz authentically, like that's what I consider my doubles. And so I can speak to that, which is that in the concert saxophone tradition, you're dealing so much with just intonation and tuning in a concert in an ensemble when it comes to chords, like triads. Jazz musicians definitely talk about intonation and value intonation for sure. Any of those people say those sort of dismissive things like, "Oh, close enough for jazz," and that's BS. That's not true. Uh,
Yeah.
that it's still a big part of the value set in jazz. But if you think about intonation in a jazz setting, a lot of times we're playing, if the pianist is playing a C7 with an A flat triad on top, if they're playing a alter dominant, you're not really, and the chord's lasting like this, and maybe the piano is an upright that hasn't been tuned in a while. You're not thinking so much in terms of like just intonation in that setting. You know what I mean? You're thinking in
Yeah.
terms of unisons, with the other horn line, or a unison with piano or guitar or whatever, or you're thinking about fifths. I feel like in concert saxophone, it's just a different level of it's a different level of priority. Maybe it's a little bit deeper. And so a big part of the pedagogy is all these alternate fingerings, that you for almost any note on the horn, two or three different fingerings for that horn and how it sounds at different volume levels and timbrally and where it sits in relationship to dead center, right? So you have a certain fingering if you've got a major third on a chord, and let's say that you know the person playing the root is a little bit low, you're going to go to your flattest fingering. You know what I mean? And there's all these kind of things you think about. So I guess I would say that training, I feel like, has definitely helped me in terms of section playing when I'm doing pops gigs or playing, with Memphis Jazz Orchestra. I have that arsenal of fingerings that I can tune to other people on the fly, like not just here, but actually here. I think when it comes to, the reverse, in terms of like how my jazz playing has informed my classical playing, it's kind of what we were talking about earlier, which is that because of that knowledge of scales and
Mhm.
harmony that we have to have as improvisers, maybe I can see a big passage or maybe even just one measure in a passage, and I can compute it a little bit faster because I'm relating it to
Totally.
a
Yeah,
scale.
and internalizing music is so much, I feel like so much faster
Right,
with that information. But yeah,
right,
that's a great distinction though, saying that it's almost like two different instruments because it really is. Like it's a completely different mindset, and that's why not many people can do it. It's because it's like yeah, just like learning a whole other uh, bag, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, totally. And I think that right there is like when I really wanted to get really serious about because I did an undergraduate degree in classical saxophone, but I did a dual degree, and so I
Hmm.
was really practicing like 40%, you know, classical, 60% jazz. The
Yeah.
DMA is when it was like 95-5 or 90-10 most of the time. And that's kind of when I realized like I wasn't really getting that many calls that were asking for flute and clarinet anyway. And so it just felt like in order for me to devote all of the time necessary to get my concert saxophone playing at that level, that professional level, that was one of the sacrifices that I made, you know. And I play composer piano, I can comp a blues with my students, but I'm not super fluent.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell just by your level of knowledge of, saxophone things in general that you probably are better at the doubles than you give yourself credit for, and piano as well. But like, I totally understand what you mean. Like, I would never want to sit in or play any of those instruments in a professional situation
Right.
and try and say that I am that,
Right.
but
I say that when somebody calls, and they say, "Oh, it's
right.
this gig or it's a pit gig," I say, "I'll take it, but let me," you know what I mean? Or like just so you know, if you're looking for this, that ain't me, but I know people, and so I don't. I guess for me, Steve, like one of the things is I just want to make sure that whatever I do, I know there's a lot of value in being a Swiss Army knife. And obviously with my students, I encourage them to have secondary or tertiary skills, or maybe not even secondary or tertiary, like multiple skills that they view as their top thing.
Hmm.
Um, but sometimes I worry that philosophy is encouraging some students to develop a multitude of skills, but none of them at an attention grabbing level, like they don't have a bread and butter. And I always just wanted to make sure that whatever I did, whatever I put out there sounded authentic, that you would never hear me give a classical recital and think, oh, that's a jazz player. And you would never hear me on the bandstand, playing a standard and think like, oh, he's kind of hacking it for a classical saxophonist. That's always kind of been my goal, is to try and do that, and that's meant whittling down some of the peripheral things, and doubling is one of them.
Yeah, that's great, and that's why you're a beast at both of those things,
I'm trying.
and they do detract. I got to have a lesson with Dave Lehman a couple months ago, and I was telling him I was like working on guitar and doing practicing some other stuff, and I think he thought that I was like trying to be proficient on those instruments, and he was like, "Well, don't forget about the saxophone. You're still a saxophone
Right,
player."
right.
And he had a great point because like the way I was talking, it probably sounded like I was not really practicing saxophone anymore. And I played for him a little bit, and he wasn't like super impressed or anything. He's heard like everybody play, so like it got me thinking. I was like, I maybe I need to pick up the saxophone a little bit more. And I think he's totally right. Like, or that mindset.
Yeah, and I think also achieving a certain degree of mastery on one, you need to do that first to know what it feels like, so that it can translate to another instrument.
Yeah, oh,
Sometimes
that's
it's
great.
early in that formative development stage, and you don't know what it feels like to feel like you really command your instrument. If you divide your practice time by 5, you may not get to that level, because we've all had this, that feeling of when you get to diminishing returns,
Mhm.
like you're practicing the same amount, but the level of growth, just the nature of it, is more incremental, and you have
Right.
to have that. There's a certain grit that comes through then, a certain resilience, a certain grit that comes through then to break through that wall,
Yeah.
and to keep making progress. And if you know what that feels like, I think that translates then if you say, okay, I want to divert a little bit. I want to get my clarinet together, or my flute together, or my guitar together, or my drums together, or bass or piano or whatever.
Right. You can then apply it to those things, but if you never experience it, then how are you going to know what it
Yeah,
is? Yeah,
exactly.
I love it, man. Well, man, thank you so much for your time, dude. This has
Yeah,
been
thank you. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at the
super awesome.
realizing like I probably gave answers that are going to take a lot of editing now. So I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You gave great answers, so
Yeah.
I might leave it all in, I might not.